I'm Brian Hill, President of Pennsylvania Environmental Council, and delighted to see all of you here today as we celebrate our 38th annual meeting of the Pennsylvania Environmental Council. For the last 4 decades, we've been working on a variety of issues trying to protect environmental quality here in the state of Pennsylvania, working on things like farmland and open space preservation through bond issues, helping to protect Keystone funding over this summer, funding that we helped support passage of in the past with voters. We accomplish our work through collaboration and partnerships. And we have been a catalyst for a lot of innovative programs that have happened over the last 4 decades in Pennsylvania that have improved environmental quality. We have worked, for example, for the reuse of brownfields and cleanup of those hazardous sites that exist around the state, because we know that the cleanup of those brownfields is essential to the revitalization of communities. We've done innovative work on water resources and air quality. We've piloted nutrient trading programs in the south central part of the state. So we've really pushed the envelope in trying to demonstrate how you can use market-based approaches to improve environmental quality in the state of Pennsylvania. And today, this is another area where PEC is very active. We've been working on energy and climate, and for the last 2 years, we've been working with the stakeholder group to put together a climate roadmap for the state of Pennsylvania. And I'll talk a bit about that in a moment, but we're really, really delighted to have such an excellent panel of people with us here today to talk about this issue. We're glad that they could join us. From our perspective, climate change is the major environmental issue that will be facing the Commonwealth over the next half century, and we need to be able to respond to it. The speakers that we have today are nationally recognized for their background on climate issues. Dr. Louis Sitzka from the USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture, is an expert on the impacts of climate change on plant physiology. He was someone that was tapped by the Union of Concerned Scientists as they had reviewers for the report that they put out looking at the northeastern states in Pennsylvania and the impacts associated with climate change, and that report included the impacts in Pennsylvania. We also have with us Tom Peterson. Tom is the Executive Director of the Center for Climate Strategies, which is under the umbrella of our subsidiary, the Enterprise Environmental Solutions Incorporated. And he's also nationally recognized for working with states and helping to motivate them, work with them as they develop climate plans for those states. He's working in over 10 states across the nation. It's a classic case where we have the states pushing public policy on this and eventually pushing national policy on this. And in addition to Tom, we also are very pleased to have with us one of our board members, Bobby McKinstry. He's an environmental attorney with Ballard Swar, and Bobby helped prepare an amicus brief that served as a basis for the U.S. Supreme Court decision on climate change, mobile sources, and how the Clean Air Act comes into play with greenhouse gases. So a very important piece, and he's going to talk about that. And then our cleanup hitter today is Secretary Mike DeBerardinis. Very delighted to have him with us. To use the baseball analogy a little further, Secretary DeBerardinis sees that there's a fastball coming down the pipe toward the state of Pennsylvania. And he recognizes that as a state that's a net exporter of energy, as a state that's a coal production state, as a timber production state, that we need to position ourselves in the batter box so that we can really get a good swing at this issue as that national policies develop. And he's been looking at carbon sequestration for both geologic and terrestrial resources in the state through the Carbon Management Advisory Group he's put together. We've been pleased to work with him on that. And he'll be talking about that initiative, which I think has national ramifications. Before the panelists begin, I'd like to give you a quick flavor of the work that we've been doing on our climate roadmap to set the basis and framework for the discussion that will occur about Pennsylvania. We began the roadmap process 2 years ago. It was a stakeholder-driven process to try to solicit perspectives on what we could do to reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions in the state of Pennsylvania. One of the key things that we did was develop a greenhouse gas inventory and projections. We did that in cooperation with Tom from the Center for Climate Strategies, extraordinarily helpful with that. We wanted to build consensus on the various policy options that are available to the state of Pennsylvania, and we wanted to come out with recommendations, and we indeed did come out with 38 recommendations on how the state could reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It was a wide variety of perspectives that we had around the table. representatives from nonprofit groups, utilities, from business and industry, as well as from two major departments here in the state, the Department of Environmental Protection and the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. We looked at historical emissions from 1990 to 2005. We did projections on those emissions out through 2025. We looked at a variety of greenhouse gases, and we used the common metric for carbon dioxide so that we'd have the greenhouse gas equivalent for the various greenhouse gases that we're looking at. We looked at a host, all categories of emissions in the state of Pennsylvania. And what we found was that in the year 2000, Pennsylvania emitted 316 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents. Pennsylvania generates 1% of the worldwide emissions of greenhouse gases. We're listed number 3 in this country for our emissions behind California and Texas. And if you were to compare Pennsylvania to other countries around the world, we would be in the top 25 nations for emissions. So we are a major emitter. And from the Environmental Council's perspective, because we have such major emissions, it's important that we take, as a state, a leadership role in trying to reduce those emissions. The emissions that we have based on 2000 in the state of Pennsylvania compared to the U.S. Emissions overall, the average are comparable. There are slight differences. You'll notice, for example, with electricity, our emissions are somewhat higher. That's because we're an exporter of electricity. If we jump down to residential and commercial, our emissions related to that are higher as well. Pennsylvania, 85% of the housing stock in the state of Pennsylvania was built prior to 1980. The national average is 65%. So we have a lot of older building stock in the state. We have slightly higher emissions associated with fossil fuel industry because we are still a state that produces both coal and gas and also produces oil. We then projected emissions based on current activities, those projections looking out over time to 2025. And what we found was that by 2010, if we have business as usual in Pennsylvania, our emissions will rise to 335 million metric tons. By 2025, it will grow to 383 million metric tons. We established a goal to try to reduce our emissions to 25% below what they were in the year 2000, 316 million metric tons. That would get us down to about 237. In other words, we're looking at those projections. If we look at those projections, reducing our overall emissions by 146 million metric tons by the year 2025. Our policy recommendations covered the gamut of things that you might think related to energy and those activities that could impact greenhouse gas emissions. We recommended an increase in the alternative energy portfolio standards to 25%, something that would be near and dear to Representative Ross's heart, since he was very much involved in that legislation when it was making its way through the General Assembly. We also talked about a Tier 3 energy conservation initiative to try to flatten out the growth in electric demand in the state of Pennsylvania. We endorsed the creation of a public benefit fund based on electric generation that would help underwrite certain activities, including education. Talked about applying new appliance standards in the state of Pennsylvania, which other states have already done, carbon offset potential. And Pennsylvania generates 19 million metric tons on an annual basis just from coal activities and emissions from coal mines. There's a real potential for reductions associated with that, and we talked about that in the report. 1 million Pennsylvanians spend more than, 1 million households in Pennsylvania spend more than $1,400 a year on gas heat, so we thought that, talked about the potential for a benefit fund related to that. We also talked about the Energy Star provisions and how they might be used in Pennsylvania for new buildings. And if you look at housing construction in the state of Pennsylvania, only 500 homes at this point have actually met the Energy Star requirements that the EPA has established. We talked about retrofitting existing buildings using the home performance standards, biomass, biofuel aiming for 25% coming by the year 2025, methane collection from our associated with our wastewater treatment plants. We've already done it with our landfills, so it seems appropriate to look at other opportunities. And education, education, education. The most successful programs that we have related to the environment in the state of Pennsylvania really rely on education, so we need to focus dollars there. Cellulosic ethanol has great potential, and I'm sure that Secretary Eber and Venus will talk a bit about their look at that issue. Tire efficiency. The cars that you buy, when you first buy your car, are very energy efficient tires. The second set you buy are not as energy efficient, and we can save tremendously if we look at energy efficient tires at the right, obviously at the right pressure. Bobby McKinstry actually helped us with a chapter on smart growth and reform commission recommendations and how we might use those to reduce emissions. The clean vehicle standards that we've already put in place in Pennsylvania will lead to significant reductions, and DEP is currently looking at truck idling and how we might address that. Finally, we looked at sequestration possibilities. No-till farming presents, and other agricultural activities present a real opportunity for sequestration. We worked with Rodale, who made some fairly large estimates of what those possibilities might be. We've made somewhat conservative, more conservative estimates based on what we think might be real in the state of Pennsylvania. But we're actually working on the ground with the capital RC&D right now on a no-till project to look at the amount of carbon that can be sequestered by that initiative. Afforestation on abandoned mine lands, real potential associated with that, and of course geologic sequestration. And the latter 2 points I'm sure Secretary DeGardinas will talk about. To close the gap, if we look at the various options that we talk about, the existing AEPS program will reduce things by about 7 million metric tons emissions. Our current forest resources in the state, if we can maintain that, will sequester and does sequester about 14 million metric tons on an annual basis. The Clean Cars program that has passed is about 14 million metric tons. That's already in place. Biofuel, 25%, 12. Agriculture, no-till, sequestration, looking at 11. If we modify the alternative energy portfolio standards and add an energy efficiency portfolio standards or some programs related to that, we're looking at significant reductions. Afforestation and a combination of our other recommendations gets us to about 121 million tons of reductions. So there are significant reductions associated with that, but we still have a gap of about 25 million metric tons that we need to be concerned about. And carbon sequestration is one of the things that we need to look at seriously in the state of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania should look at participating in a national cap-and-trade program. It would be much more effective and useful for our state, I think, if we looked at a national as opposed to a state-driven program. And as the governor looks at this issue, we think that we should create a climate council that should look at those specific recommendations and ideas to kind of flesh out how we can implement that in the state of Pennsylvania. In closing, in my remarks, I just want to remind us that this presents us a huge challenge in trying to reduce our emissions in the state of Pennsylvania. We're a major emitter. However, it presents an economic opportunity as well. If you look at the investments from the Mesa across the state, if you look at Con Energy and the recent development of, or announcement of the development of the solar array in Bucks County, if you look at GE Transportation in Erie, which produces the most energy efficient locomotives in the world and employs 4,000 people in northwestern Pennsylvania, these challenges present opportunities, and we need to remember that as we look at economic development in the state of Pennsylvania.